I'd like to welcome all of you to Juniper Level Botanic Garden, and we are going to take a little excursion, kind of walk through the gardens, and today we're going to be using our ears and try to use our eyes to see if we can locate and see what some of the sounds are in the garden. And one of the things that's really important with gardens to consider, we always want to try to accommodate some aspect of wildlife. And there are certain sounds that, for summer are kind of signature of summer. And among those are crickets, katydids, cicadas, even frogs, of course birds. And birds are dependent on, what do birds eat? They eat plant seeds, but they also eat insects. So we always want to make sure that there's a balance in our gardens. So I'm sure, how many of you, when you're working in your yard, in your garden, you hear things? You hear things in the trees, you hear sounds. Do you often know what those sounds are, though, and who and what's making them?
Some of them.
Some of them you know?
Not all of them, but...
Not all of them? Well, we're going to, that's good, about 50%. And we're going to talk about some of the groups of the animals and insects that are making these sounds. And then we're going to talk about some of the specifics, because believe it or not, each different species has a different call and a different time of day oftentimes that they're active. So with that said, we're going to start this way, and we're going to gravitate towards the 41 garden, which is it's the oldest and in many respects probably the more established garden.
Nice.
And as we walk, as we make our way, you'll hear in the distance some of the cicadas. And the one that let's take a second, listen. You hear that kind of high-pitched oscillation? That is one of the earliest cicadas that we hear here in North Carolina. That is called Neocicada hieroglyphica. About mid-July, end of July, they become less common. So that is he's one of the last ones that you're going to be hearing this time of year, because it's more of a late May through June into the first half of July. Only the males make these sounds. With cicadas, only the males make the sound. And do you know why they make the sound? Does anybody know why a male cicada would make sounds?
Attract the female.
Attract the female, exactly. And what's really, really interesting, cicadas are making that sound with their eardrums and a resonance chamber. You know, the eardrum is a membrane that bounces. They have a resonance chamber. The abdomen of the male is basically hollow like a drum. And there are muscles that can contract and move, that can generate airflow and pulses that make sound. So the sound is essentially, he's using mechanisms that are part of their hearing system to generate sound. That's kind of unique and interesting. Another thing that's cool about cicadas, unlike other bugs, just like you, to thermoregulate when it gets too hot, they sweat. So they use evaporative cooling to cool down. And cicadas also oftentimes have very specific temperatures that they're active. And most of them you're not going to hear them until their body temperatures are upper 70s, maybe low 80s or warmer. So they have to warm up. They like it kind of hot, which is why we call them dog day cicadas, because these would be the dog days, the hottest time of year. So we're going to walk over to the 41.
All good after
They die.
Yeah.
Cicadas are seasonal. They take, most species, several seasons to go from egg to adult. And they only live for maybe a week or two, up to a month. The adults feed on sap, just like the nymphs. They have a beak, a mouth part where they feed on sap. They rarely occur in numbers that do any kind of damage. And the cicadas you're hearing are all native. And they're also typically on native plants. So there's no real damage done by them. Essentially, they're beneficial because they move nutrients through the forest, and they're also a huge part of the food chain, as almost everything eats them. Everything from snakes and lizards to birds to squirrels to foxes, raccoons, skunks. There's really very few things that won't eat them, including humans. Earlier, humans used to eat them. And they taste kind of like cashew when they're cooked. So, yeah, kind of the texture of shrimp with the flavor of cashew. Not that I'm a big bug eater, but I have tried them. They're musical. I kind of think, what would summer be without them? They occur in almost all of the temperate, tropical, and subtropical parts of the world. In the U.S., we have about 200 species. With crickets and katydids, quite a few more. So there are many, many species of crickets and katydids. But what you're hearing in this hottest part of the day, these are cicadas. Into the 41. Everybody gets quiet. Most of the sounds we're going to hear in the garden, we're going to hear them from within 30 to 45 minutes of sunrise to just before lunch. Then during that hottest part of the day, things are a little less active. Then it begins to pick up a little bit again later on in the afternoon when the sun intensity is a little less and the temperatures begin to be a little bit more moderate. But a lot of it also has to do with the sun angle, because right now the sun's straight overhead, so or nearly so, and so that makes it a little bit hard for a lot of these animals. They do exactly what we do. They find the shade, they find something to drink, and they chill for a little while. So a lot of the critters that would be making sound are being quiet or being less active right now. So we'll walk this way. Isn't it always the case? Things are really, really active until you want to talk about them or try to find them. Let's stand here for a second. I hear one in the distance. It sounds kind of like a ratchet.
You're talking about cicadas? What are we listening to?
We're trying to hear.
Here, or there's a bench here. You can do two and up, two and down.
It sounds like a ratchet. It has kind of a cranking sound, a zip, zip, zip. You can barely hear it. I don't know what to say, Chris. They were very active a few minutes ago, and the second we walk over here, everybody gets quiet. I can. If you put your hand up to your ear, kind of listen that way. It just sounds like if you had a ratchet, a crank. That is. They
were loud the other day.
They were loud, and it's really, like I said, a lot of it's timing in the day. They were actually loud about an hour and a half ago. That one that sounds like a crank, I always think it sounds like a ratchet. That one's called Robinson cicada, and they will call from late morning all the way into the evening. So we'll keep on walking.
Same family, that's why
They are. There's a bunch of really, really closely related ones, but each one has a different call and a slightly different time of day that they're most active. Sometimes after we get the irrigation system runs, or if you get a rain, you'll hear frogs. And gray tree frogs are one of the common ones that we hear in the garden. And we also sometimes hear the green frogs. Green frogs sound like a banjo, kind of a bonk. Yeah. So sometimes you'll hear the green frogs. We have leopard frogs. We have a number of species of frogs, but usually frog activity is something you're going to hear right before, during, and right after a rain. So frogs are going to be active when we've had water. And like I said, when we run the irrigation systems, sometimes the frogs get really excited. So you'll hear a lot of frogs. Yeah, they do. The frogs get real excited with the irrigation system. Now you can hear them, I think, a little better.
Yeah.
Do you hear that?
It's like
Sounds like a ratchet,
like a
clock. Tool. Yep.
It's like ring the clock.
Yes, it does. It sounds like a gear or a ratchet. That is a really common cicada around here, Robinson cicada. I was hoping we would hear like a few more different kinds. But you can definitely hear them a little
Sounds
better.
in the garden?
You know, not all the sounds in the garden are animals. Here's a good sound in the garden. This is the sound of running water. And so with water features like creeks, or, you know, some people have bird baths that'll trickle down and then recycle back up. Sometimes water is a really nice sound in the garden. It's very soothing, it's very calming. So it adds a lot of dimension to a garden to have a water feature. Not only is it good for certain kinds of plants, but like I said, it also adds a sound element that can be very soothing.
Very cool.
It is very cool.
I want to go in the water.
I do too. You're not the only one. I kind of want to take my shoes off and walk through it, cool my feet off. Feels good, doesn't it?
That was warmer than usual.
Was it a little warmer than you thought?
Very good.
Yeah. Okay. You hear that one? Almost sounds like an air conditioner fan.
But it's constant.
It's constant. It's got a little bit. That one's lyricin. It's another species of cicada. All of these cicadas that you're hearing
It
are.
was only like a bunch of same cicada, but group of them.
No, it's a lot of different species. Each one is making a different sound. Did you see how that sound was very different than that other sound?
Yeah.
A little bit later in the evening, there's one. It's actually the largest cicada in North America. They're common in people's yards that have oak trees. They like oaks.
How big are they?
They're big. They've got about a 4-inch wingspan.
Wow, that's big.
But it's also one of the loudest. Very, very loud. And you will only hear those, or I say, well, not only, but they are most active that last 30, 45 minutes before sunset. But they're really loud. So this evening when you go home, listen that last 30, 45 minutes, and you'll start hearing them. And you'll recognize it immediately because it's going to be a very loud, almost a roar through the trees. But that's a really cool one. And a lot of people from different areas, when they move here, and even some of my neighbors, they'll say, what is it up in the trees that's making that sound when it starts getting dark? But like I said, each species is going to call different times. And the same thing, like at night, when the sun is set, you know, and you sit on your deck, you'll hear different buzzes or sometimes constant buzzing. Those are your crickets and your katydids, which are active at night. Most of those are going to be more nocturnal, whereas your cicadas and some of the katydids are going to be diurnal, which means during the daytime. So either right as the sun is rising or right as the sun is setting. But once it's really dark, you're not as likely to hear those insects. You're going to start hearing the crickets and the katydids.
Did you learn all this? Separate all the sounds?
Well, you know,
They sound similar.
they do sound similar. Part of it's just kind of familiarity, and then other part is getting out in the field, and when you're hearing these sounds, isolating them, find what's making the sound and catch it. So like with cicadas, believe it or not, there are nets that are 30 feet long. And you have to find it on the branch calling, and you have to catch it, get it in the net, and then get it back down to the ground without it getting out of the net, which that isn't always easy. But you have to isolate a lot of those sounds, and so a lot of it really is about collecting them when they're out making those sounds. And the same with frogs. And I don't know if you've ever noticed when you hear something like a frog or an insect, have you ever tried to find it or just see? And it seems like the closer you get to it, then the sound seems to be somewhere else, but then you look and then the sounds. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah.
If you really want to try to triangulate where an animal is, think about how many of you have dogs or cats? What do they do when they're looking at something with their ears? The ears immediately start to, if you take your hands, put your hands behind your ears, aim your ears, even if you aim your ears towards these people talking, that's another sound in the garden. You can begin to isolate and triangulate where a sound is. And if you ever watch a cat's or any other animal's ears, the ears are in constant, because what they're doing is they're collecting those sound waves and they're focusing them in. Our ears work because they've adapted to human language, which is a little bit more of a broad spectrum. But if you're trying to isolate one little sound in the garden, you can do what a cat or a dog does. Just take your hands, scoop them behind your ears, and start kind of, and believe it or not, you'll be able to figure out, kind of isolate where the sound's coming from. So it's a little trick you can do. You can teach kids to do it. Kids love it. Once they figure that out, finding the cricket or the frog is real easy then. Mm-hmm. Do you have any questions so far about anything?
What are those noises, the things come over there right now?
That is water. Let's go over here. You know, we're talking about water features. Oh.
I mean, I hear the cicada things too, but
Yes,
Oh, that's a pretty little waterfall.
it is. And as you get closer to the water features, hearing the other things will be a little bit more difficult. Sometimes you can hear things like dragonflies when they go zipping by. Even hummingbirds. When hummingbirds are coming to a feeder, have you ever heard the hummingbirds? There's kind of a whirring to their wings.
I don't remember now.
And of course, we all are familiar with the sounds, the high-pitched hum and whine of gnats and mosquitoes, right? We all know that sound. That's another sound of the garden. It's a sound of outside. Sometimes working in the garden during open house, we hear sounds that come from the public. There's always that potential when someone has tried to touch a plant that doesn't particularly like being touched. Those can be interesting sounds, but that's more of a botanic garden sound than a home yard sound. Or the sound of a mother telling the kid to get out of the water. The way this grotto is designed to face towards the house, if you sit here with this running water, one of the things that it really does for a garden, right on the other side of it, there's a pretty busy road. But if you sit here any time of day and you're listening to just the water running, you will almost never hear a vehicle on Sauls Road. So there are ways also in which you can use sound in the garden to shield against other sounds that you don't want to hear. And water is an excellent way to do it. Do you have any questions? No? And I'm not hearing many birds, but like I said, when we're in the middle of summer and it's the hottest time of day, most of the animals are doing what most of us would do, kind of avoiding the direct heat. So they're out and about. They're just not going to be noisy until I quit talking about them and they get back over to the visitor tent. Then about 4 o'clock, everybody's going to start making a lot of noise again. Plants can also make sounds as the wind rustles through them, depending on, let's step aside here. The automobile passing us is going to make a sound. Unless it's a Tesla, they don't make much sound.
Yeah.
Right? I like the sounds a lot of times when we get breezes and the sounds that you get from plants, and some plants are better at making sounds than others. I like the sound in my yard when, even here in parts of the garden, when the wind is blowing through plants with really big leaves, like the bananas or the palms. You get that rustling sound, which really to me sounds nice. So, like I said, all different kind of sound elements in the garden. They don't necessarily have to be made by animals. We'll come around back through here. Get back in the shade a little bit more. Now we can really hear them.
Yeah.
And those that are zipping back and forth, like I said, to me, I've always thought it sounds like a ratchet, or like she said, a clock, like when you're winding a clock. And again, that's Robinson cicada. And they tend to be pretty high up in the tree. Some species are lower. That one tends to like to be pretty high. And the insect itself, they'll call from a lot of different trees, but they like trees that are in the cedar family or the juniper family. They like things in the Cupressaceae. They don't damage the tree, but the adults and the nymphs feed on sap at the roots. But one of the things that they do when they're feeding on the sap, you know, we think of insects and things that are feeding on plants being a bad thing. They're also aerating the soil. They're also, when they're feeding on the roots, it encourages the plant to send roots out even more and further, which allows the plant to interact more with the soil. Their activity in the soil increases the presence of a lot of the symbionts in the soil that the plant needs. So there's a very strong beneficial relationship between many of the insects and the trees and the plants that they feed on. The plant needs the bug needs the plant. And if you think about it, you're looking at many thousands of years of interactions. So it's a really good mutual.
They help open up those flowers to eating the sticky, what do you call it?
Sap?
Yeah.
They don't really go deep into the plant, but they feed on the sugar-filled waters that the plant is moving. And again, it has no impact on the plant. They're related to some bugs that are really bad, like aphids, but cicadas don't occur in those kinds of numbers. And even the ones that do, like the periodicals, they're natural pruning for the trees. Every 13 to 17 years, that's a great thing for the entire forest.
What? They come every...
There's some species that come every 13 to 17 years, and they come in by the millions. Some cicadas. They're called periodical. And a lot of, there's this impression by people like, oh, this is terrible. But it's the single largest dose of fertilizer that the forest will get in a single event. So it's really good for the forest. It's good for all the animals. All the animals have full bellies. There's bird. You know, what kind of bird is that? Some birds I know and some of them I don't. I definitely recognize.
Small one. I've seen it when I worked in the grain maze, but I don't know its name.
I've heard that one around my house too, but I
And you know something? I'm really good with the calls of a lot of the bugs. A little less so with the calls of the birds. We can always, you know, what's one of the best way to find out what the sound is? Let's go see if we can find it. I do recognize our catbirds. I do recognize our fishing crows. I do recognize the owls and the hawks when I hear them. I recognize some of the more common birds, the blue jays. You see him? You know, we need vents. But birds are an excellent, they're a great element in a
It's the second one. It just keep moving over there.
yeah.
Did you see it?
I did see it, but now it's
Okay.
behind the. I do see it, but I can't really, any other than a silhouette. I'm not getting a real good.
Went to the other side and.
Yeah, not getting a real good look at it. But when you have a garden, anything you can do to encourage seed sets. You know, a lot of times we want to cut back our flowers. I like to leave my black-eyed Susans, my cone flowers, my sunflowers, even after they flower, because the golden finches like them. So, you know, we want to encourage things like birds. Birds are also another good soothing element to have in the garden because of sounds. And I'm beginning to hear more birds. And I am woefully deficient when it comes to identifying birds based on their calls. And you would think that I would be better at that, but there's so many ornithologists that specialize in birds. I kind of specialize in other sounds that nobody else ever really thought about. But I wish I could answer your question on some of these little birds.
Make a sound?
Is it just the fluttering?
There are some with the fluttering of the wings. There are a few species of butterflies that can make clicking sounds with the wings, which they will do in territorial displays. Some of the brushfoot butterflies can kind of click their wings. It's kind of a thumping of the wings together. It's with the wings themselves are kind of a hard membrane exoskeleton, like the rest of the insect. And so there are a few species that can make a clicking sound with their wings. Did you hear that sound? That's the sound of a cicada making an alarm call. And I'm thinking as long as that alarm call was, somebody got it. And there's a big wasp called a cicada killer that'll get them.
So it's got.
And there's birds that'll get them. So that was a long enough squawk. I think somebody found that one. So it's dinner now for somebody. Oh, you know, it's part of the food chain. We'll walk around this way. Do you notice how everybody got quiet?
Yeah.
Usually when a cicada makes an alarm call like that, they are all going to get quiet because that means somebody's out there looking for them. And even if it's a different species, they all recognize that call. That call is the scream of yikes.
See, everybody feels bad.
Do you feel bad?
I do.
You feel bad?
Feel threatened.
You know, I just look at it as being kind of a necessary evil. It's probably already done a lot of what it needed to do. It's probably already mated.
Has to happen, I guess.
And you know, somebody's got to eat. Do we have any other questions? So some of the sounds with gardens.
Yes.
Birds, crickets, grasshoppers, katydids, cicadas.
You discourage rabbits eating my
You know,
flowers, and I never see it.
And the
Sometimes-
deer in my neighborhood.
sometimes the more integrated that our gardens are with plants and animals, the greater the biodiversity, the more we can discourage pest problems, because nature, you know, exists in a really good balance. And unfortunately with our yards, one of the things we do is we throw that out of balance. And so when that balance, when that equilibrium is off, it tends to open up a niche for animals and even plants that we would consider problems. So I try to encourage people, maximize your diversity of what you plant. Don't plant all the same thing in one place. Spread it out. There are ways that critters can be discouraged from being in the garden and doing things that we don't like them to do. I've got a dog, and she's a great deterrent. Let her out in the yard, she does the perimeter, sniffs it, marks it. The deer don't particularly want to go anywhere the dog is marked. Because technically a dog is a wolf, and to a deer it doesn't really think any differently. It smells that and it's like, okay.
Same for rabbit.
It's a little different.
It's okay.
You know, it's I don't know really how to answer all those questions ethically anyway. I just say it's something that it's something we have to kind of learn to live with. You know, we are ourselves part of nature, and it's an inevitability. There's always going to be something that gets in our yard and does something that we're not going to like. We just have to kind of strike that balance and find out what we can and can't live with. Do we have any other questions?